The study of a negative resistor teaches me that the conventional wisdom being that the only source of power is a power source is only partly right, but it's partly wrong. Resistance to which power has been applied can be a source of additional power under the right conditions of negative resistance. And that explains why Henry Ford was able to create a free energy device predicated on a flywheel, the flywheel of his Model T car, having slots correctly placed in there for cow magnets, but you had to start up the engine and get the flywheel going at an initial minimum RPM for it to be effective. And then you could turn off the motor and put it in neutral and drive around without any loss of energy. Where was it coming from? Negative resistance. But that's only because the power was initially applied to the resistance. Now, what was the resistance? Inertia. Magnetic inertia, kinetic inertia, combination of factors. But what else is there in a flywheel? It's just inertia for its motion, and then there's the magnetic effect of the cow magnets interacting with the case, the metallic case that the flywheel sits within, and who knows what the interior of that case looked like, being magnetized by the cow magnets as they passed by, maybe certain ribbings, ridges, internal ridges to the chassis of the flywheel. Whatever it did, energizing the chassis of the flywheel to serve as a temporary magnet, an electromagnet of sorts. However it worked, it was a combination of factors. Usually it doesn't take too many to effectively produce negative resistance, but only because the kinetic motion had been set up initially, and the magnetic behavior was indirectly set up initially by the kinetic motion of the flywheel. Provided that was set up, the flywheel and its chassis serving as a negative resistor, the resistance of the resistance of the demand made upon that flywheel by the car, the whole chassis of the car, wanting to move forward because, why? Because it wanted to slow down. Air drag, resistance of the bearings on the wheels. So that resistance, the fact that it was already in motion and the resistance was being supplied by all those factors, so it leads one to wonder, what happens if you came to a halt at an intersection, let's say? Would you be able to restart without the use of the motor? Or without the use of the gasoline motor? No, then you put it in neutral. But otherwise you put it in gear. So it's the fact the flywheel is moving and it doesn't want to stop, and the fact that, let's say you came to a dead stop, you have to be able to accelerate. But if you're driving on level ground, it's not too bad. And you're driving a Model T, which isn't going to drive, it's not going to accelerate to too fast a speed anyway. So it's able to recover while it's cruising, at which time it doesn't need a whole lot of driving force applied to the wheels to keep it going. So it's the resistance of the car who wants to stay at rest. You came to a dead halt. Yet the flywheel doesn't want to lose its motion. It doesn't want to give it up. And so it supplies more force to have something to share with the car so that the car won't slow down the flywheel. Only because it was applied already, and because the flywheel is behaving as a negative resistor. So it isn't the storage of energy. See, I thought, oscillating power is the storage of energy, and then you got to worry about swinging, the child swinging on the pendulum. That's a minor role if it exists at all. The main role is negative resistance, because resistance placed upon something that already has a stored charge given to it by some power source but is no longer being supplied by that power source, can somehow, that component that exhibits resistance of a type can somehow create energy from thin air. From thin air. And I've been trying to seek ways to explain it in conventional terms, but there is no way to do it. Oscillations does not explain it. I wish it could. I wish I could appease the naysayers who don't want to believe in free energy, but I can't. I have to say, put it the only way possible, that it is provocative and out of the box to conventional wisdom, because we live by Ohm's law. We don't live by the reciprocal of Ohm's law, yet that's what negative resistors do. They live by the reciprocal, in which, normal Ohm's law, normal electricity, as an example, because Henry Ford's car is not strictly definable in terms of electrodynamics. There's also the kinetic motion of the flywheel to consider. So negative resistance comes in various forms, not just electrical. I guess in this case resistance is inertia. It doesn't want to change its state of motion, whether it's at rest or whether it's at a certain speed. It wants to maintain its inertia, even though demands are being made upon it to change. If the demands are within a certain limit, a certain parameter, a window, it responds with more energy to maintain its inertial state. So that expression that an object at rest wants to stay at rest unless, or an object in motion wants to stay in motion unless altered by outside forces, leaves something out. It's not that it's wrong. It leaves out the fact that negative resistance can do the opposite of that within certain limits of demand and certain limits of what, how well does the negative resistor respond once it's been given some energy. So I found that when playing around with Eric Dollar's LMD chain of modules, along with the fact that I had a spark gap going with it, along with it, and a capacitor in parallel with the spark gap, if I shut off the power under certain configurations, the power actually skyrocketed even faster than when the power was being supplied. But it already was skyrocketing very slowly, gradually increasing when the power was on. So the power was supplying something important, but it was also holding it back from skyrocketing too much. So really the way to regulate free energy is you can't slow it down, at least not in simple terms. If in terms of just one singular influence, the first and primary thing you would want to do is cut the power down to a lower level, but you don't want to cut off the power entirely. You want to reduce voltage, amperage, I don't know. You want to reduce something coming out of the power source, going to the negative resistor, but you don't want to cut it off. And so all you've managed to do is actually, no, that would increase the power output too. No, you'd want to increase. Oh, you would want to take some of that power that's coming out of the thing and feed it back the front end. Always a certain portion, not a certain amount. Like 80% or whatever. Whatever it took to slow down the thing, which means you're still increasing the overall circulation of power, which means the whole thing's going to fry. There's got to be another way to do this, obviously, to regulate it. But anyway, that's just something I'm going to have to monkey with. I can't guess at it. I have found that with certain configurations, the power output is greater than the input, but it's rock solid. It warbles up and down until it finds its happy sweet spot, and it just sits there. And it's way more than what the power source provides. Yet it doesn't escalate beyond that point. And that's the kind of free energy device I want. Something that's rock solid in its output. But there are other configurations that are not rock solid. It escalates much more slowly at first. But then, as it's increasing its power output, it's also accelerating its rate of increase. Very gradually at first, but as things progress along, the acceleration increases as well as the power output. And then the whole thing just takes off. Which, begs the question, how? Well, a negative resistor is a resistor that has had some power applied to it already, such that you can cut off the power source and the resistor becomes a source of energy under acceleration of that production, and just increases and increases the rate at which it increases its power output, even though the power source has been cut off. Now, I never completely cut it off, so I wonder what would happen if I cut off the neutral, because I was only just cutting off the hot lead coming out of the AC source, not the neutral as well. So I wonder what would happen if I cut off the neutral, or kept the hot, connected, but just cut the neutral. There's the rub. Maybe it's the neutral I have to cut to really sever the tie. See, normal logic will never work. You got to try something different, and I haven't done that yet. So talking out loud has helped me think, well, I haven't considered that distinct possibility, because there's nothing normal about a negative resistor. And we've all been programmed the same way to ignore it for the most part. And only rarely do we ever run across it. And there's only one article on Wikipedia that talks about it. As far as I'm concerned, I've never run across this before up until now. Just one article on negative resistance talking about gas discharge tubes, how they behave. But it doesn't say enough. It doesn't say what happens when you cut the power. If it has no choke, that the thing's going to accelerate as well as increase its output. I mean, it's like phenomenal what a negative resistor can do under certain conditions of configuration. I can't stop talking about it, but it is so awesome because it goes beyond oscillating power. I mean, oscillation is a behavioral characteristic of a negative resistor, but it is not its explanation for its existence. It's just the way it walks and talks. It walks and talks like a wave. But it's not oscillations alone. There's something more, because why would additional demand made upon such a negative resistor increase its output and improve its acceleration even greater? Because when you think about it, when you take away the power source, you're increasing resistance right there. Because the power source is not supplying the power to make up the difference for the resistance. So now you've got resistance you never had to deal with before, and the thing responds with even more output than before. So when resistance goes up, the power output goes up, and the acceleration of that increase of power output also goes up. It's phenomenal. It's truly phenomenal. But it changes the way we have to think about our reality. Talk about Paul Simon's song "Slip-sliding away." The more you get closer, the more you slip-slide away. Oh, how more true can you be? I always thought that was a song not worth listening to. You know, it's like, come on, that doesn't make any sense. Well, now it makes sense a little. Oh boy. Slip-sliding away, slip-sliding away. The more you get close, the more you slip-sliding away. I want to take a guess that Tesla's statement that for every 200 pounds of iron added to his device, 1 horsepower output was increased. I want to take a guess that it was applied also to the Henry Ford example that I gave, inasmuch as the chassis of that flywheel was very heavy cast iron, and if certain ridges were placed on the interior of that flywheel in such a way that the cow magnet went past those ridges. What do we know about ridges on a magnetizable substance? They are the place where magnetism comes out of a magnetizable substance. And the flat surface, it does not come out of the flat surface of a magnetizable substance. But it's a two-way street. You know, it's like the lens effect. It's, you know, counter EMF, but in the magnetic sense. So the magnet is going past the ridge, and somehow the increased mass of the chassis alters how that ridge responds to the proximity of the cow magnet flying by it, such that power increases rather than diminishes with the increased mass of that flywheel. You know, attached part of that ridge. You know, the ridge is the surface of the flywheel. And it has something to do with the ability for the iron to become saturated with magnetism from a fixed source, the cow magnet. It might obviously also have to do with the arrangement of the ridges, you know, the orientation of them versus the orientation of the cow magnet. So I don't know, but there is something provocative about the fact that that's an iron chassis, and it's not going to be lightweight any more than the flywheel is lightweight. Now the flywheel might be energized by the cow magnet as well, so there's that to consider as well. And maybe there are no ridges on the flywheel. Maybe the inserts for the cow magnet makes the cow magnet flush with the surface of the flywheel so that there are no ridges. There might be a crevice surrounding the cow magnet, a gap, a slight gap, that would be the bas relief, you know, the inverse of the ridge on the inside of the chassis. If it's ridges, it might be the opposite. Instead of being a positive ridge, it might be a negative ridge, a groove. And maybe the magnet sticks out, or maybe it doesn't. See, you know, there's all kinds of situations. I have no way of knowing, obviously, but the mass of the chassis and the mass of the flywheel are obviously factors we can't ignore. And the fact that both, not just the chassis, may be magnetizable, you know, the flywheel, in addition to the chassis surrounding it, the flywheel chassis, is a very thought-provoking thing. I'll probably never entirely get away from wondering, you know, what does the iron of the grounding rods have to do with anything, but it has to do with, that's the electrode of a gas discharge tube of a sort that you're trying to set up in the earth. in the Earth itself and its own magnetic field is the gas that's going to be energized and become that negative resistor. It's the magnetic field of the Earth that's going to become that negative resistor. But you have to interact with it. It's a magnetic field, so you use something that's magnetizable, namely iron, steel grounding rods, copper-plated steel grounding rods. But that's not the significant thing. The significant thing is that the Earth's magnetic field is behaving as a negative resistor. Because magnetic field, we put an iron core in a coil winding to lend resistance, inductive resistance, to a changing magnetic field. And yet that inductive resistance can become a negative resistor under the proper influence set up by some other instigating factor, in this case the neon bulb of Barbosa and Leal's Earth Captor. So it's a fascinating behavioral characteristic of magnetism that we can turn it into, not just neutralize the lens effect, as Clarence says. I knew there was something more to this. Not just neutralize the lens effect between the two toroids, but actually turn magnetism into a negative resistor, such that that magnetism can increase with itself within the vicinity of the grounding rods, provided you have enough rods or enough magnetism or both. I'm trying to zoom in on what's going on in the Earth here that would cause it to give extra energy. And it has to be encouraged by the action of the neon bulb. But, what is going on? It's something we don't normally think about or take advantage of. It's a really cool idea, negative resistance. It's unbelievable. Yet it's a fact of life. It's how fluorescent bulbs work. It's how neon bulbs work without working. They just slide away into hyper-productivity. That's the point of the title. Not that you're getting farther away from satisfaction, but that you're getting farther away from poverty, destitution, lack of satisfaction. The complete opposite. So the accelerated value of slip-sliding away is there as an analogy. But you're not sliding away from satisfaction. You're sliding away from lack of satisfaction, lack of fulfillment, which is, in this case, power. We want power to run our machines, so we can have all the power we want to have. And it explains why we have dark ages in between cultures. Cultures rise and they fall because karma, Mother Nature's got to balance out the books. So we have periods in which we have so little energy, yet we work so hard and produce so little and have such short, miserable lives. That's the dark ages in between each rise of culture, rise of civilization. Yeah, when it goes up, comes down, right? And that's the oscillating nature of power as it is, but in particular negative resistance seems to exhibit that oscillating nature, but it's not the prominent feature that we want to think about, because we just want to think about production of more power. But in the large view, it is one big wave that oscillates. Sometimes we have negative resistance, sometimes we have positive resistance. And we got to take it and roll with it and reinvent ourselves when we get a whole lot of positive resistance, and keep reinventing ourselves so that we can keep moving along, just not in the way we set out in the beginning, but in some other way, so that we don't always have positive resistance in our way, and instead have negative resistance. Right? Isn't that what we want? Life to be blissful and easy and productive and enjoyable. That would be the byproduct of negative resistance. But you have to be flexible and have a certain amount of rebound in order to sustain that at all times. You can't keep just doing the same thing all the time, unless you're never challenged. Those of us who come into life with challenges, we have to keep reinventing ourselves, or else we can't maintain our momentum. We'll just slow down and come to a complete stop and be miserable. And why be miserable? There's no point to it. It serves no useful purpose. So I find those two qualities of rebound and flexibility together. Rebound is a kind of faith thing because it really doesn't supply the whole answer. It supplies simply the motivation based on a premise that's largely one of faith. So when I think about it, I do have some faith. Okay, faith Ahura, I stand corrected. I'm not completely self-doubter. But the other aspect is flexibility to change, to be willing to do something else if what you're doing is not working out. And the willingness to try to do something else because what you're doing isn't working out. That's the rebound part. But that part has to be taken on faith, that you actually will come up with something that will be more suitable and give you negative resistance instead of positive resistance, so that you just slip-slide away from inertia, from stasis. You slip-slide away from stasis and from suffering and from boredom.